racial justice, the word privilege comes up a lot. White privilege comes up a lot. Male privilege also will come up. And sometimes I think when we discuss privilege, we don't really get into like the nitty gritty about how it works. Okay, so we understand that privilege is something that allows us to turn away from the cross, to turn away from the suffering of others or those who may have disadvantage or be in a disadvantaged positions. I think privilege works in the sense where it allows us to neglect and be unaware of the places that we need to grow. It allows us to turn away from the suffering or a discrimination or prejudice that other people may face. But privilege also, I think, can you all hear that? Is that loud? Hold on one second. I think privilege also prevents us from connecting with ourselves. And this reminds me of something that Dan mentioned in the previous session about this journey and this returning to God is bringing up a lot of things internally for folks, but it's also causing folks to ask the question of like, where have we strayed from God in the past? Where do we continue to be separate from God? And like, what is the difficult work that we need to do to make amends for those things? So when we look at this story and we see this younger son squandering his wealth, I think that could be seen as a metaphor of any abuse of privilege or blessing that a person has. And, for the sake of this conversation, I don't want to make it seem like, whiteness or white privilege is like a blessing in that sense, but I want us to understand how privilege works and how it works in this story. The abuse of privilege tends to have a disastrous result. When we look at the younger son, we see that he, entered into poverty because of the abuse of his privilege or of his blessing. Within the context of spiritual reflections on racial justice, we see the abuse of privilege has led to racial disparities. It's led to the neglect, the destruction, the disavowal of Black life, of Black voices, of Black humanity, but not only Black people, but folks of other people of color, of various different races. So we see that privilege as it works is something that, when utilized wisely, it can be something that is used to help others. It can be used as a platform to offer a voice or to help to prop up the voices of other people who don't have that platform. But when privilege is neglected, when privilege is denied, when it is made to seem as though it doesn't exist, we see how destructive that can be. Because privilege, it's not always destructive in the sense of somebody wielding a sword or actually, weaponizing their privilege against something, but it's simply the neglect of it, which allows other, horrific things to take place and to carry out and to happen. So when we look at this story, the son straying from God and neglecting, and abusing that privilege that he had and that wealth that he had, it was that state of emptiness. And I think that state of poverty that he entered into, where not only he realized the error of his ways, but he also realized what it was like to live a life without privilege, without financial wealth, without economic stability, which one could argue allowed him to see the other side of the coin. One could also argue that he had come from a place where he was sheltered, where he didn't really experience hardships in the sense of somebody who may not necessarily have an inheritance or economic stability in that way. So being in that place forced him to see how the other half lived, essentially, but it also was the catalyst for his return to God, because it was that humble state that he entered into, which was a prerequisite for him to ultimately return to his Father and recognize the error of his ways. But it was also that humble state that allowed him and that made him realize, I think, that he's no different than anybody else, that he is, I don't want to say, well, that's not the right word to use, but I think that humble state brought him low in a sense where he could ultimately be brought high upon his return to God. And I believe that is a verse in, I don't know if it's Thessalonians or Timothy, where it says that God brings what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God brings what is high in the world low to shame. I'm sorry, I'm getting that wrong. God brings what is strong in the world or weak in the world to shame the strong, what is low in the world to shame what's high. Essentially, God uses people in their humble state to balance the scales. So it requires entering into that state of humility to return to God in the ways that we need to. So this also brought up the question for me: does God give privilege? I think that that's a tough question to answer, but we must recognize that privilege is a part of the world that we live in, and the relinquishing or the loss of that, or striving to distance ourselves from that privilege, I think is a humbling act that is essential on that journey towards returning to God. Um, and I think that that validates that return. I think it authenticates. I don't know even know if that's a word, authenticate, but it makes that return towards God more authentic. Um, so for the sake of this conversation, I'm also not asking that everybody see like, whiteness as being related to this prodigal son who's straying from God, and then, returning to God is like healing the sins of racism and white supremacy. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to paint a picture of how I think near everybody can see an access point in this story. And oftentimes, I've seen myself as that son. Some people may see themselves as the father. Some people may see themselves as the other son. But there's a lot to be learned in this story and the progression of it, and what occurs in the son's absence. The second thing that I wanted to discuss was the character of God. And in this story, God gives choices, or the father is giving the son choices, even knowing sometimes what that son or what we will choose. And I think about parents who know their children better than children know themselves. And I think about this story, and why would God give the son, or why would the father give the son a choice to stray and commit, wasteful or exploitative or harmful acts, even knowing that was a likelihood? But why does God allow or permit certain things to happen in such a way? And if you all will remember the story of Habakkuk, where the prophet was trying to understand why God had preordained or allowed certain, oppressive conditions in the world to exist as they were. And the prophet continues to ask these questions like, how, God, can you sit here and look at this wickedness? Or how can you allow certain things to happen? And it brings up the question for me in this story: why does God allow that squandering of wealth? Why does God allow that abuse of privilege? And I think that, privilege is something ultimately that is man-made in a way, and it's something that's born into. I think that there's a difference between blessing and privilege, and man-made privilege. But we also have to understand that, God ultimately gives us a choice, but in that choice, there's always the choice to return to God and to humble oneself, and to recognize that we can use the privilege or the blessing that we've been given for the benefit of others. Because what that does is it strengthens our faith, it strengthens God's relationship to us, because God can spend our entire lives trying to get our attention to no avail. Therefore, there has to be some area of tension or process of straying and returning that believers go through, for us to understand the power of return, but also to understand the power and the character of God. Um, when I think more deeply about the character of God, and sometimes I've heard it talked about as, it's like when we feel close and near to God, we're always going to be, showered in that glory and that mercy and that love. But I think that the character of God is more often than not being distanced and far away from human beings. I think the Bible itself is a compilation of stories of people who had not yet returned to God. And oftentimes there's small glimpses towards the end or somewhere in the middle where people do return and there is that reunion. But I think God functions more often than not in place or at distances from us. So I think us understanding that, we have to do the proper work to take it amongst ourselves to do that return, because God is not going to do that for us. And sometimes that requires relinquishing of the privilege, recognizing the situations that we're in, and taking the proper steps to return. But in that return towards God, I think that there's four things that we should keep in mind. That whatever privilege that a person has, or whatever situation a person is in, God's heart towards us is always love. Therefore, folks must also have love for themselves in that journey. Two, God wants us to return and wants us back in God's embrace even more so than we want to. Number three, God is after honesty, not perfection. And in that return, ultimately, we have to choose to live different, more wholesome and fulfilled lives. And that is a life of humility. That is a life of recognition and relinquishing of privilege. So these are two things, as I mentioned before, the character of God and also how privilege functions and how it works along the spiritual path that I think we need to keep in mind when folks are doing reflection on how this journey has impacted you, where you've grown, where are areas that you still feel like you need to grow, and where is it ultimately that you want to go. So before I continue, are there any questions or any direct responses to anything I've said this far?
Carlisle, can you repeat those 4 things? I only got down 2.
Yeah. So the return to God is essential along the spiritual path. The return to God strengthens our faith and strengthens God's relationship to us, because God can spend our entire lives trying to get our attention so that we can relinquish that privilege or recognize the error of our ways to no avail. Therefore, there has to be some event of straying and returning that believers undertake in order for the return to God to be authentic and in order for us to actually feel the saving grace and transformation and reorientation that God has that awaits for us. And in that process, our fealty and love is secured because I think the Spirit of God is always trying to secure us in places of nearness to God. But the way human life works, the way the flesh works, the way that this world works, God understands that that's not something that's always realistic. God understands the flaws and the errors of human societies, of human cultures, of human ways, of human nature. Therefore, that process of straying and returning is not what is the word I'm looking for? It's not to be looked down upon, right? But it is essential if we're able to grow along that spiritual path, which is why I want folks to see this journey of returning to God and the work of racial justice as an opportunity, as Dan has said on many different occasions, as an opportunity to come into deeper awareness of who you all are as First Church, deeper connection, relationship with other communities, but also deeper understanding of the character of God and how God works through seemingly difficult or unequal or harsh human situations. I guess I don't know if I'm saying or communicating that right. So those 4 things, Lindsay, sorry, I'm just trying to give you a framework. Those 4 things is that God's heart towards us is love. On that journey, the driving force is love, not shame or guilt, like we mentioned before. Number 2, God wants us back and closer to God, even more so than we want to. Think about the father in this story and how he must have felt when the son had strayed and was off in a distant land. Number 3, God is after honesty, not perfection, because it's in that honesty that we can humble ourselves. That son, when he was squandering his wealth and he was working with those pigs and he was in a state of poverty, it required him to be honest about the error of his ways. It required him to be honest with himself, humble himself so that he could return to his father. So God is after honesty, not perfection. And 4, in our return and in that subsequent return, we have to figure out and commit to a way of choosing to live different or more wholesome lives where we can stay nearer to God. And that's something that we're going to continue to work on in the next phase of the call to return sessions about like the external work that First Church can continue to do. So those are the four things, and then the character of God, and then privilege. So are there any other questions? I saw something in the chat. This is good. I want to pose this to the group before we go into our breakout groups. Alex said, what is the difference between blessings and privilege? Is it that privilege is human made, but blessings are something that only come from God? What do you all think about that?
Okay, Dad, we gotta go.
I think I would say one thing, just to be really honest. I feel like when I say my prayers at night, thank you for all the blessings of this life, it occurs to me that I have, I'm not sure I ever have thought about this, to tell you the truth, that being white in our society is a blessing. I have counted that as a blessing. And I'm really shocked by that, by saying that out loud. And so what I'm realizing is not so much about being white, it's about the human made, as you were saying, significance that gives me the privilege, that white therefore equals privilege in our society. It's not necessarily a blessing, but it's given me privilege to live a certain way. So it's not something I would thank God for. So anyway, I don't know if I'm being articulate, but I'm wrestling with this since I've heard you speaking.
And thank you for bringing that up, Alex, because the very fact that privilege exists in the way that it does, i.e. in whiteness, what does that say about the character of God? You know, and going back to Habakkuk, when he's struggling, trying to understand why things were the way they were in his society, you know, I've asked myself that question before. I know you all have asked similar questions, or like, why does, you know, systemic racism function in the way that it does? Why do we have all of these, you know, sinful ways that, and isms that we fall victim to? And I think that it brings up the question of the character of God, who I fundamentally think is about love. But I've been reading this book that some of you all may have heard of, The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And that's one of the most phenomenal books I've ever read. And it's a heavy book, don't get me wrong, but it's just how and I feel like I'm so many of these characters, but anyways, how she discusses God in a very stark and sometimes like, it's difficult to digest how she discusses God. But one thing she says is that God is change, you know, so God is change. God is in process and in motion. And as Alex mentioned, like being aware of that blessing versus privilege, the privilege, the human privilege that folks have, that's not something that's like permanent, right? You know, if our relationship to God, if this journey of returning to God is a process of changing and returning to God, and if God is change, then I think that even though the fact that privilege does exist, we shouldn't deliberate about whether or not God wants that or doesn't want that, but the fact that God calls us to places of change, and changing our ways, in spite of that privilege, or using that privilege as a motivation to change. Yeah. So are there any other thoughts about that tension between privilege and blessing?
I think of privilege as being something that is taken, not given. Sometimes we forget that white privilege and the privilege of able-bodied persons and privilege of heterosexual males involved a theft at some time of power and status in society. I think of a blessing as a free gift. It's a gift of God's grace. It's a gift from one person to another, but it does not involve a theft.
Where I've gone with this is that, but at the same time, there's those in power and with status can ascribe to God blessing and make it divinely attributed when it's not, right? So that the attributes that might be linked to privilege start to become imbued in an understanding of God's blessing, which in a sense is reinforcing privilege in some interesting ways. So the way that they disentangling them is an interesting challenge.
Before I started this work, I always thought of privilege as monetary, and that was it. But since I've started this work, privilege has had a whole new definition for me. The privilege class was those one percenters, and
You know, this similar to what Jim said, it's easy to conflate privilege and blessing. Um, and if we think back to the framing sessions that we had, of just seeing how race and theology were so intimately connected, theology being used to justify the racial caste system, racial hierarchies, white supremacy, all these things, black inferiority. All of that is using God to work out our. Let me restate that. That is an example of using God and God's word to create privilege and sustain privilege under the illusion of blessing, right? With the story of Ham, of the curse of Ham, the descendants of Ham are condemned to be black and sinful, and that whole thing that we talked about earlier on. So I think that when we're discussing the spiritual significance of like this racial justice work, it requires people to constantly be in conversation with a critical eye of one's own privilege, and how conflating that with blessing can lead a person to a position of apathy, indifference, not necessarily wanting to engage as intensely as, say, they may have wanted to do in the beginning. But going back to the story of the prodigal son, um, the recognition of that privilege, the deconstruction of that privilege through the loss of his inheritance, through, the relinquishing of ideas of whiteness and white supremacy. What that is not just making somebody a better person morally, but it is essential if a group, a person, an individual, a community is to better understand the character and nature of God. You see what I'm saying? So that's why this is all just trying to reaffirm and re-solidify in people's minds like how important this work is. And I know I don't have to tell you all this; it's something that you know. But I think that it's important to revisit, to revisit those motivations, because I think that this is something that will be sustaining for folks as they move forward. Um, Sue puts in the chat, it might be helpful to consider that privilege is an attribute that involves comparison with others' conditions, but blessing isn't necessarily. That's a good point. It is, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, this is Barb. I was going to say it's somewhat of a power imbalance issue as well when you think about privilege. Not that it's necessarily intentional, but it is that comparison to others. Like either you have it or you don't. Whereas, as Dave said, blessing is a free gift. I think available to all and not contingent on anybody else's, power over you.
Yeah. These are all great points. And so everything that's been said, I'd like you all to hold it and keep it on your mind as we move into the breakout phase of our discussion. We're a little bit over schedule, but that's fine. What we'll do is reconvene at 6:30. And the questions that I put in the chat earlier, I'll put again. So these three questions: what areas have you grown the most, been most challenging? Where do you want to continue to grow? This is all involved in this conversation about privilege, but I also want to add another question. And these are three that these are going to be standing questions for our last two sessions, today and next week. So don't feel so pressed to try to answer all of these right now. I just want you all to be thinking about them while also exploring this idea or topic of privilege, and discuss amongst yourselves just more about this difference between privilege and blessing and how that has manifested itself in your life. How has it affected how you move in the world? And then also, like, with this knowledge going forward, like, how does this inspire you to change? Dan, did you have something?
Yeah. First, I have the breakout rooms ready to go. The recording doesn't capture this, the breakout rooms. And I wonder if it's not too much to ask at the beginning of your breakout sessions, if somebody could just jot down a few notes. You could open up an email and send it to me. You could maybe try to, I wouldn't try to put it in the chat. I'm not sure that the chat saved the breakout rooms, but if possible, if it's going to be a distraction, don't worry about it. I see this as a follow-up of our conversation when Carlisle wasn't here, where we all said beautiful things about you, Carlisle. And this is more about us. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to capture what this transformation has been, or what kind of changes you're experiencing. As I mentioned, I just yesterday submitted a grant report, and I used some of the quotes from last time, but I may want to send a little appendix along after tonight. So do what you can, if you don't mind, in terms of capturing some of the highlights. Okay.
And the question about privilege are in the chat. So discuss amongst yourselves as you enter your rooms.
Back at 6:30, 6:32, something like that. Okay, great.
Everybody back with us? Okay, good. So in our group, we had a very rich discussion about this tension between privilege and blessing, and how folks understood both of those playing a role in their life. You know, how they understand privilege in the Bible, and like God's relationship and role in that. We talk most about challenges. So that second question, what has been most challenging for you in this process? And then also the question of relationship to privilege and using it for good, and the relationship between privilege and blessing. So I want to open the floor to you all to discuss any of those. I do want to focus on this conversation we were having before about privilege and blessing, and then also what has been challenging for folks, because I think that those two are very, very related. And then in our final session, we can talk more just about like using privilege for good, or like, you know, where do we want to continue to grow in this work? But yeah, in terms of like challenges, I want folks to focus on that for now, and then until the conversation either like stays there or we go somewhere else. But yeah, I open it up to you all to reflect and share some of the things that your group discussed. And the question, what has been most challenging for you? Relate that to your privilege and your experience. So it could be what has been most challenging in this work in general, but try to locate it in this conversation about privilege and blessing.
One of the things that I find challenging is the balancing act between acting responsibly and shedding privilege. Because when you work in an organization, you have certain responsibilities, and they may involve having power over other people. And you, it's not clear to me which is the best way to balance those two things.
Yeah. Well, you know, Alice, I think when you talk about privilege and power, privilege often grants people power, but like if you're talking about a position of privilege and it has power over other people, I think that there's always like a responsible use of like authority, you know. For us to think that that is just going to completely be non-existent is not realistic, because we still have to operate within like the guidelines of like how human society is set up. So being aware, and Chris mentioned something in our group, that one of the major problems with privilege is like the lack of knowledge or lack of awareness of it. And that's when the abuse of power and privilege tends to proliferate. As we see in this story, the son was not aware of his privilege. He was not aware of that inheritance and what that meant for him. Therefore, it was a situation that was ripe for disaster. A lot of people who may not be aware of that racial or gender privilege it can be disastrous in the abuse and of that and the exploitation of people who don't have that. So in coming into knowledge and awareness of one's privilege, I think that creates new mandates for that person. And I think that this is what God requires. I think that that person is required to be aware and call attention to their privilege in any and all spaces, and know how to not do their job or like lead in the ways that they need to lead. And sometimes that involves having power, but using that privilege responsibly, using it to prop up the voices of other people who may go unseen, or who may go unheard, or prioritizing, like, say, the concerns of people who may traditionally fall to the margins. And that is an example of that privilege being used for power. And then somebody else for good. And somebody else in our group mentioned, like, if we're aware of privilege, if we use it for good, if we invite the Spirit into that process, can the privileges that we have become blessings when we use them for other people, to help other people? And that's a question that I want you all to think about and reflect upon. But before I continue talking too much, I want to open it up for folks to respond.
I think one of the things that came out of our group was talking about, first of all, the challenge of identifying what privileges we have. And that is something that I keep running into all the time. And I thought, oh, that's a privilege I have. But then, to be honest with myself, what privileges am I willing to give up and put aside? Is another challenge that I think we have to deal with, or I have to deal with.
One of the things that I said in our group was that I think privilege, growing up with privilege or having privilege, allows you to, this is a challenge, allows you to turn away from the oppressive part of white privilege, and it allows you to not have it in your, something that you're thinking about all the time. And I feel like that's a challenge that I want to overcome, is to be able to divert my attention from turning privilege to good or confronting racism. Very cute doggy.
Thanks.
We didn't use the exact language you used, Carlisle, about knowledge of the privilege and power. You said creates new mandates. But I think our group kind of talked about that feeling, that sense of beginning to get an understanding, beginning to get a new lens, and then, wanting to take responsibility and do things differently. And someone in our group expressed through this particular journey and through the church and these discussions, that realizing that answers to that, well, what do I do, is informed by, and again, Carlisle, this is your language, inviting in the Spirit to inform, and to kind of going really contemplatively, not trying to intellectualize, okay, this is what I'm going to do tomorrow and it's different, but to be very meditative in that new awareness as to what feels right. And then kind of following on from that, a couple of people in our group talked about trying to have the courage then to follow through with the things that you feel that you should be doing, and that it feels uncomfortable and it can feel scary, and you can worry about your own hypocrisy, that somebody could call you out as a hypocrite because you're living within, say, financial and economic and health security, and you're yet encouraging people to recognize their privilege and take next steps. And so kind of conquering that and moving through that and having confidence that it's going to be uncomfortable and to have the courage, I think, were things that we all talked about.
Very powerful. Thanks for mentioning that, Carrie. Just one thing I wanted to add to that too, and we've discussed this a lot throughout the past few months. What can I do, or what do we do? You know, what do we do? What do we do? And this just makes me think of one of the first things Dan said when I started at First Church, of like sitting with knowledge and I like listening and not always being pushed to action. And like that's true. And especially with these spiritual reflections, is supposed to open something up within the self, to reorient, to repent, to reorient, to return, to repair, to transform. All of these words that we've been discussing, notice that those are things that have to happen within the soul of the individual. So I think that even now, looking back on these past few couple months, not like what do I do, but who do I want to be? Who have I been? Who have I become throughout this process? And who do I want to continue to be as we do this work? And then what do we do? That'll come, that'll come after. But it requires a certain disposition of heart, of mind, of spirit, so that a person can be sustained in the work that they're called to do. The thing that I learned in seminary, I was always wondering, why is this like an emotional and spiritual boot camp? Because it's a preparation for a life of spiritual leadership, which you cannot be successful in unless you go through the inner work, the toiling, the theological reflection and all those things. And that's what we're doing here as a group. So yeah, who do we want to be and become?
Along with what Linda said, I reflect on NPR, what I heard today, and it's sort of the same thing about a former CDC chief under, I think it was under Obama, who was, when he was trying, the one thing he wanted to do most in life was to become a doctor, and he came from a rural Black community, and he never thought that he could ever get there. And when the protests were going on, he had to make a decision. If I get arrested, I may never go to medical school. And and it's hard enough being Black to get into medical school. But he took the challenge, and his story was a good story in the end. He took the challenge because he believed so strongly in it, and did get arrested. But he got into medical school and he became chief of the CDC. So it's having, for me, that challenge is to have that inner peace. I'm 70, so I always think I can't go to any of these protests because I'm going to get COVID because I'm more at risk, and maybe that's not a good example, but if the push comes that I need to do more to challenge myself, what kind of things am I going to give up to use this knowledge that I've learned? And what kind of risks am I going to put myself at? And that man was I wish I could remember his name, but that man was very inspirational this morning.
He was David Satcher. Yeah.
I absolutely love, Carlisle, your phrase, who do you want to be? And when we're done tonight, I am going to put it in 72 font right in front of my computer, right up here. And I'm going to meditate on that. So thank you.
A word that Kathy said that stuck out to me was risk. The risk of, doing this work of recognizing privilege of what might happen when folks actively strive to relinquish that. This word risk, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Kathy, because I've been thinking about that all week. And I think about Jesus's call to follow him and to bear that cross and to pick up that cross and to follow him. And then I was also reading James Cone's Cross and the Lynching Tree book in his chapter on Dr. King, and how a central part of Dr. King's theology was cross bearing. And he saw himself as bearing a cross, and he was called by God to bear. I remember it was funny because I was reading his biography, and I think when he was a child and he was in college, him and his friend, they got together, and his friend wanted to drink some beers and go party. And then he scolded his friend, and he said, "We are called to bear the burdens of our race, and you want to have beer, and you want to go drink beer," or something like that. And he had this deep conviction, this spiritual conviction to lead, to preach, to teach, to do all the things that he did. But that wasn't solely under his own strength and will, but that was a call from God. But that was also his cross to bear. So if you all think, and if we think about this work as bearing a cross, because when fear sets in, most human beings are risk averse. When the risk comes up, when the discomfort comes up, folks want to turn away. I mean, that's natural. Like, nobody always leans into risk. But by reframing in our minds what it means to do this work, why we're doing it, why God calls us to do it, will, I think, strengthen folks to be able to lean into that discomfort and recognize that the call to return is also the call to bear a cross. Because returning to God, as we see throughout the Bible, is always an uncomfortable and difficult and crooked process. It's never comfortable for the prophets, for the prophetesses, the teachers, the healers, whoever it is we're looking in the Bible. It is always an uncomfortable process, that's where the healing and the teaching of the narrative stories in the Bible is seen, is in people's return to God, and people's listening. So embrace the risk, embrace the discomfort, as it is the cross that I believe First Church is called to bear at this moment in time. And that could change in the future, but there's a lot of opportunity there for self-realization and growth if folks see it as such.
So Carlisle, you're bringing up King reminds me of those who were on the Road to Freedom tour and being in the King's kitchen and having very powerful, his voice coming over the speaker of when he had his conversation with God about his fears and about his doubts about moving on. And I think fear is a natural part of this. Risk aversion is natural, as you said, but moving forward anyway. And sometimes that, again, like as with King, it involves a return to God. And doing this work in this spiritual context is so much greater, as some of us have mentioned previously, than doing anti-racism work through work or something. So I've really appreciated these opportunities to frame it in the way you have.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, because my question in our session was what one of my challenges was, I never thought I left God. Why am I trying to return to God? And so you finally answered it tonight. I've been struggling with that this whole session. Is like, I haven't left God. What's wrong here? And now I understand. I mean, it must have been in some of the readings, but I never understood exactly what it meant. So thank you, Carlo.
Well, no problem.
I've made these points before, so I'm sorry to make them again, but they just keep coming to my mind. And that is that, the work isn't linear. It's nowhere near linear. And And so I think that's been something that has really been reinforced in these conversations, where you kind of think you get it and you think you've absorbed it and you're ready to move on. And then somebody or something happens in your life and you get into a new disequilibrium and you're not sure again. And I think that is the biggest challenge for me, and certainly from sort of this white supremacist, I can read enough, I can practice enough. It's like the violin, I'll get it right and I'll be a virtuoso. And that there's no end game to this work, right? And so that's sets me off my lifelong equilibrium anyway. And something I did say in the group is, when I have fear of how I'm going to talk about this work and how I'm going to intervene, both like internally as well as externally in the world. And when I hit that fear, and it makes me want to go back to being comfortable and taking a nap mostly, I think about, well, what harm did I unknowingly do for 60 years? Like, I know I'll stumble, but at least I can have, more compassion and curiosity, more capacity to be able to stumble in what I know is the return to God, what I know is the right direction, and the ability to try to repair when I do make mistakes and I'm called out for causing harm, and, learning that as a skill. So for me, God is always there, as Carlisle has said, but it's a bit of a vortex. Sometimes you're, in the flow, and other times you're not. So that's how I feel about it.
I can't remember if I've shared this image with this group. Some of you will know it from our work praying with the Psalms, in praying with the Psalms, that Walter Brueggemann in his spirituality of the Psalms talks about how the Psalms meet us in moments of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. And that's not linear either. Sometimes we're feeling oriented, sometimes we're feeling disoriented, and sometimes there's sort of this new horizon and I find that all three of those things, sometimes I experience them all at once, but more often we're moving between those places, and along with that image comes one from Ignatian spirituality that I've shared with many of you as well, of moments of consolation and desolation. I think about, and this work sometimes feels like a consolation. It feels uplifting, it feels fulfilling, and at other times it can feel like the tide, like I think of this as the tides in Cape Cod Bay. Sometimes I feel God's presence, or that this work is so alive in me, the tide is high. And other times it feels like the tide is 2 miles out and I'm never going to kind of see or touch that water again. But what Ignatius assures us is that all of it is a natural part of a spiritual life. It's not that when you're in a moment of consolation, God has left you, or that you're not still in some relationship. It's just the sort of tidal aspect of how these processes sometimes can happen in us. We feel full of God. We feel God's absence. We feel full of excitement, enthusiasm about this work, and we feel completely despairing and like we're never getting anywhere. Both and, right? Not either or.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, Dan. And it brings to mind in Ignatian spirituality, like this consolation, desolation, and like the call to return, like straying and return. It's like the same thing, right? And the thing that's interesting about it is like when we talk about it, we think, okay, we're either close to God or far away. But then what about in between? What about when we're just like existing and we don't necessarily feel like really, really desolate and alienated from God, but not really, really near. And we're just like, yeah, God, I know you're there, but like, I'm just not feeling it, and it's just, you're in the middle. And I think that most human beings spend most time there. And the call to return, and like the power of this work is, and knowing about like the cross to bear, the burden to bear, and all of these themes and reorienting and transformation. Because when you keep those things in your heart and understand that it's a part of a bigger picture, then in those moments where you are in the middle of the tide, you can still go on, and you can still squeeze out some passion, and you can still rely on the strength of the Holy Spirit to push you forward. Because in that moment of like apathy or indifference is when a lot of people just say, I'm not doing it. You know, I'm done. Let me take an extended break. So yeah, like knowing those phases and knowing where you're at in them is really important. And they are it's always gonna happen. That pendulum is never gonna go away. And the only time where we're fully consoled is essentially like when we have ascended and we're like in heaven, you know, if that's a part of your theology, or when we're near to God in the next or the beyond, or whatever you want to call it. So I guess for the sake of this conversation, let me just bring it back in. But yeah, just know that it's normal. That process is normal. Just being aware of where you are is the first step.
I'm wondering, is some of the comfort of doing this work in community that we're all not in the same place at the same time. And so there is a way to share in the carrying of the work in a way that if we were to try and, I mean, that's, as I think about this as an individual, the challenge of, even if I'm trying to sort of work out of my own privilege, the layers of institution and culture and things around me just feel like, oh my gosh, this is too hard. And if I am in moments of wherever on that journey, whether it's in the middle and just kind of sitting still, or that feeling alone in that, or then I have to carry it all kind of because it's just me. Even if I feel the Holy Spirit individually, I think the sense of the collective community in the Spirit and our ability to kind of carry the water for each other at these different places and times when we're individually in different moments of this kind of journey feels really important. And so again, to be in this kind of conversation and learning space, even on Zoom together, it feels like that's important.
So we got about a minute left. Are there any last thoughts before we move towards closing?
Well, I was going to say one thing about it's from what Jim said about learning to listen to God, learning to listen to other people, and learning to have realized in these sessions that I learn differently than other people do about things. I'm a visual learner. I'm not a reader. I'm not that sort of stuff. So so sometimes I feel like I'm left behind, but it is with everybody that people learn in a different way. They listen in a different way, and God listens to me in a different way. And so that's my final closing statement. But it is a lot of part of listening is a big part of this.
Listening. Yeah, we discussed that in our group too. And that is very important. And one thing that I mentioned that I want folks to also know is, and I know that a lot of people have felt like this is not knowing like when to speak up or when to make space or when to just listen, and like this constant like oscillation of thoughts and like, or how can I be the best, you know, the most, you know, aware and the most conscious, the person who's let go of most privilege. Like everybody's always striving to be, I think, perfect in those spaces, but also recognize though too is that as a person who is coming into awareness of their privilege, it requires listening, but also speaking. And what I mean speaking, not speaking over or speaking at, but an indigenous elder told me one time that the seat of the soul lies, they believe in his tribe, the seat of the soul lies in the throat, because that's where an individual speaks their truth into existence, speaks God's word. speaks truth, speaks love, all these things. And that's where they become who they are. So like also knowing that in listening, that is a preliminary step before one is called to speak, and to speak a new life and a new truth and a new reality that is contrary to what folks have been taught or socialized to believe in. And in those spaces, trusting and believing that the Spirit will guide you to speak and to listen at the right times, but also centering the Spirit in that process, centering God in that process, and making sure that any type of racial justice work, whatever it may be, or extensions of this work that you do is all a ritual spiritual practice, as these sessions have been throughout the past couple months, and remembering that as you go forward. Leave it. So what we're gonna do now, thank you all for joining and for being here. I just would like to close in prayer before we disperse. Dear Lord, creator of heaven and earth, creator of joy, of us, of our bodies, our minds, our communities. God, you call us to difficult spaces and places. You call us to return to you. And this journey that we know is crooked sometimes is not only difficult, but it is perplexing. As we seek to make sense of this path that we're on, as we seek to make sense of the character of you, and also the state of the world, Lord, give us a spirit of confidence, of fearlessness, and the ability to face the risks, face the discomfort, face all the challenges that may and will lie on that journey, and just give us strength, God. Just give us passion, give us confidence as we move forward, as we know that we cannot do this by ourselves, that we cannot live, that we cannot thrive, that we cannot experience the best and worst of your creation by ourselves. So God, please walk with us through any and all things. Be near to us even when we feel far from you, even when we are in moments of consolation, of desolation, and everywhere in between. Lord, allow us to see the signs or the small hints or the small moments of joy and connectedness to remind us that you are there present with us in that journey. And God, lay your hand upon our families and our loved ones as we're dealing with the fallout of a global pandemic, of isolation, of alienation, of uncertainty about the future, all these different things that you know we face in this world, and allow us to know that you have joy and you have restoration that awaits us, and healing and salvation. And we pray all this in Jesus' name as we go forward in our weeks. And the church said, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Carlisle.
Amen. Thank you, Carlisle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlisle. Night.
Thanks. Good night.
Night, everybody.
Adios. Bye-bye.
Thank
Night,
you.
everyone. Thank you.